Hi, I'm retired NYPD Detective Vic Ferrari, and welcome to NYPD Through the Looking Glass podcast, where you'll get unique insight into the New York City Police Department. Before we get started, I encourage you to check out my Amazon author page, where you'll find my series of behind-the-scenes NYPD books. They're $10 paperback, $2.99 ebook download, including NYPD Law and Disorder. Today we're going to have a great guest. She's a retired 29-year member of the Los Angeles Police Department, 8 as a civilian employee, 21 as a sworn police officer. She's also the best-selling author of 7 books, including A Dozen Deadly Roses, Collateral Damage, A Deadly Prayer, Grave Impact, A Deadly Justice, A Deadly Denial, A Deadly Beauty, and the Buckner Trilogy series. Kathy Bennett, welcome to the show, and how are you today?
I am great, and thank you for having me.
No, the pleasure is mine. Kathy, please tell us a little something about yourself.
Well, let's see here. You did a good job. I worked for the Los Angeles Police Department as a civilian employee for 8 years, where I did clerical work, and I had wanted to be a police officer from about the age of 12. I thought I would either be a police officer or a blackjack dealer, which seemed very glamorous to me. But the police officer eventually won out, and I joined the LAPD in my mid-30s and never looked back. I currently live in Idaho with my husband, who is a retired police officer, and 2 Labrador retrievers and 1 cool cat.
Cool cat. What got you into policing? Like, what was behind you wanting to take a job as an LAPD cop?
Dragnet. Jack Webb and Dragnet. I thought I was going to be the female version of Sergeant Joe Friday. However, oddly enough, I did not become a detective, but I really, there's gray in the world, but for me, life is often black and white. Just the facts. Tell me what, give it to me like that,
Bullet points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how TV and movies, because I was the same way. It was movies and TV about the NYPD on the East Coast. That same thing, which was that I got infatuated with the NYPD and then I wanted to join. How many LAPD police officers are there?
Well, we've lost a lot in the last few years. When I retired, we had just over 10,000. Now they're down to about 8,500, I think. Yeah, it's really tough. It's really tough. For a while there, they've had a real hard time recruiting. And I mean, you were a cop, you can understand. It's not a good time to be a police officer right now.
No, it's not. And if I read this correctly, LAPD patrol officers work 3-day, 12-hour tours and 4-day, 10-hour work weeks?
Yeah, it depends on what your assignment is, but most patrol officers are working what they call the 3-12. They work three days on for 12-hour days. However, I mean, if you get overtime, then that 12 hours can turn into 16 or whatever. I loved it. I admit it. I was kind of I was an overtime whore. I didn't bother me at all. I worked mostly what we called morning watch back then. Now they've assigned all the different shifts numbers, but it was morning watch back then. And I worked that, not because I enjoyed it, but also anytime I went to court, it was overtime because I was off, my shift was over.
I loved overtime myself as a fellow overtime whore, but in NYPD, we worked 8 hours and 35 minutes, or if you were a detective, 8 hours and 15 minutes, and it was 2 days off and then 3 days off. And then when I retired from the NYPD, I worked for a smaller police department for a cup of coffee, and they had a similar schedule to LAPD. And for a guy in his 40s, when I joined this little police department, those 12-hour and 10-hour shifts were rough with no overtime. And I remember saying to myself, what the hell did I get myself? That's a young person's game to work those out. It really is, because people don't realize cops with overtime, and it's not like a job where you can say, I'm going home. If you've got a prisoner And I don't know how it is with you guys dropping him off in the LA County Jail, but with us, you make an arrest and you're down at Bronx Central Booking, and the desk sergeant says, you know what, he doesn't look right, take him to the hospital. The guy's going through heroin withdrawal and he needs his methadone. You can't hand him off to someone else. You're married to that person, and an arrest that sometimes, you could be done in your regular shift, you could be with him for 2 days. People don't realize, and there's no going home. You know what I mean? Because no one's going to relieve you. So, and you've got to be on your game because he's going to slip out the back door if you're not paying attention. Because prisoners, they love going to the hospital because you let your guard down and they're in the wind.
Yeah.
How many? New York City's got, I think, 8 or 9 million people. How big is LA as far as population?
I think that we are at about 4 million, maybe. And I say I'm no longer there. I'm living in Idaho, but I think it's about 4 million, and it's probably more. We just don't. It's probably
what the census didn't get right.
Yeah, exactly.
What years were you active?
I became sworn in 1990, and I left in 2011. I was thinking, okay, wait, you did 21 years. How is that? Math's not my strong suit.
No, I went to summer school for 3 years with math. You were relatively new, right, during the LA riots?
Yeah, I was. I had about, probably about a year and a half on.
What was that like for a rookie cop to experience that? Like in New York, we had several riots, not as big as the LA riots, but we had the Crown Heights riots, then we had the Washington Heights riots. So I'm having been in a couple of riots myself, but I mean, the LA riots in '92 looked a hell of a lot worse than what we had to deal with. What was that like?
For someone new to the job, well, I don't honestly, I don't care whether you were new or old or whatever. It was pretty exciting. I mean, it was. It was chaos. Your officer need help calls going every which way. The first day of the riots, I was working with another guy that was pretty new as well, and the people would go and they'd go to a shopping center. And they'd all go in and loot. They'd break down the doors and they'd loot. And then there was a guy in the back of a pickup truck and he had a big white T-shirt and he'd do this. And then they were off to the next location.
Oh, so it was very organized.
Somewhat. I mean, I just think that. And then another thing that was pretty interesting is I see this guy and he's got it wasn't a love seat. It was a sofa. One man has his sofa on his back and he's running as best he can with this brand new sofa down the street. And there was no way that we were going to arrest our way out of that. We were just running from call to call. Officer needs help. Officer needs help. And that part is always scary because you don't know necessarily what's going on. Then. But after a few days, it quieted down and it was, that was another big cha-ching for the wallet, because lots of overtime.
I was going to say, you guys were probably working around the clock.
Well, they have a system where you work 12-hour shifts when they call it you're mobilized, and that means that vacations are canceled. We only respond to high priority calls, those type of things, and so 12 hours on, 12 hours off, and while you might be working those 12 hours and it might stretch into 13 or 14, it's not like we were talking about where you've got an arrestee that needs to have medical treatment or something, and you're tied up for 20 hours, type thing. You pretty much when you're mobilized, they try to get you on and off so you can go home and sleep,
Right, because you're no good Because it's with sleep deprivation, you're not even making sense to yourself. You're just doing
Right.
ridiculous things.
Dangerous.
It's dangerous actually to be out there when you haven't had sleep for that long.
Yeah.
And then people started taking matters into their own hands. I remember seeing it in that paper, and I did a double take when they called them the rooftop Koreans. When
Yeah.
to defend their businesses, they went up on the roofs with rifles and was
Yeah.
firing warning shots to tell people stay the hell away from our stores.
Worked.
It certainly did. Now, here's one. I remember coming into work when this happened. It was probably, I think, '97. I was just got to the auto crime division. Were you working the day of the North Hollywood bank robbery and shootout?
I was in court. I was in court that
Oh,
day.
okay.
And let me tell you, let me tell you, all of a sudden, officers, anybody that was in uniform, I was on a day off and in court, so I was in civilian clothes.
Right.
If I'd been in uniform, I would have gone. I would have gone. Everybody was just piling out of the car. I didn't even know at first what it was, but everybody was just fleeing, So I was on duty, but not really.
Did you know anybody involved? Obviously, you probably did.
Yeah, I did, but not close. It's not like, and I wasn't working North Hollywood at that time. I did work North Hollywood. That's where I did my probation, but not during that time.
For those of you that don't know, I think it was '97. These two guys were thrill seekers. They had robbed a couple. They were doing bank takeovers, heavily armed, covered in Kevlar, fully automatic weapons, and they went into this north. This was like their third or fourth bank robbery. They had already killed a guard in another robbery attempt, and something happened where the amount of money they thought that was going to be there wasn't, and they got pissed off and they fired one of the automatic weapons into the safe. Made a lot of noise, burned up the money, and a cop passing by heard it or saw them going into the bank, and then they were trapped, but they shot their way out, and it went on to this rampage. I suggest you go on YouTube and check it out. It was a wild scene that went on forever, and then the cops were so outgunned that they had to go to gun stores.
There was a gun store that most police officers were familiar with, and what they did was they commandeered an armored truck, a bank truck, and they got rifles because we were outgunned, and that's what introduced rifles into the LAPD.
It always takes a bad incident for the police, for the job, to figure out. We had something similar with 38s, and we had the 38 caliber revolvers. We had dump pouches. This is before my time, but this poor cop got into a gun battle. He was behind a car trying to manually load, and a guy ran behind a car and killed him. And they said, well, you know what? We should go to speed loaders. And then after another couple of shootings, we went to the semi-automatics.
Right.
I read the LAPD museum has the gunman's getaway car and one of the police cars that was shot up in the incident.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I've seen that police car. I haven't seen the gunman's car, but it's very sobering. It's very sobering.
And with the NYPD, we've had, like in the 70s, when the Black Liberation Army was hunting cops, there was a lot of NYPD cops that were slain. And I remember going out to the Whitestone Pound, which is where, you take a vouchered car, and on the piers on the west side of Manhattan where they have all the barriers, I remember specifically seeing old police cars shot up just sitting out there, and then you're like, oh, look at the precinct. Look how old this is. I know where this car is from. So the NYPD, I don't know if they're going to put it in a museum, but they still hold on to that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
You were around during the Grim Sleeper case, right?
When was that?
84 to 2007, Lonnie David Franklin was responsible for 10 murders of mostly drug addicts in Los Angeles. He was caught by his DNA. He took like a 13-year break and then went back to killing. And I think the way they caught him was his son got arrested. His son was convicted of a felony sentence. So they had the son's DNA, and then the son's DNA came back to a relative, and then they narrowed it down to him.
I had no involvement with that, the Grim Sleeper. PD it's big, but it's small. Like I told you, when I was working, we had about 10,000 officers. But there are so many people that I never had contact with, mainly because the city is so far spread out that, if you live in the southern part of the city, that's where you're going to work. I lived in the northern, well, outside the city, but just north. And so I worked mostly in the north part of the city. So there's a lot of things that we aren't even aware of per se.
Yeah, it's the same with the NYPD. I mean, we've got 30 to 40,000 members at any given time, spread out across 5 boroughs. So when you're working New Year's Eve in Times Square, or where they're bringing in 10,000 NYPD members, or you're working Coney Island on the 4th of July, you see guys and girls you haven't seen since the police academy. Like I'd run into people my 17th, 18th year I haven't seen because they were at the other end of the world as far as I was concerned. Or it was funny, and I bring this up a lot. Like I thought I was a badass working in the Bronx and Harlem. And then, as a detective, I start getting cases. I'm going out to Brooklyn. I'm like, holy shit, Brooklyn North is worse than the Bronx and Harlem. I was like, and then, you go to these details and you'd see these cops with these medals, the Combat Cross and the Medal of Valor, like with 2 or 3 of them. And I'm like, what is this, Wyatt Earp? Like, what's going on out here? I thought I was a badass in the Bronx, but so did you have with LAPD? Did you ever have any calls with any famous people?
I was trying to think about that because I know that I have met and dealt with celebrities, but I don't think I ever had a call with one, which is unusual. In North Hollywood, that's where a lot of television shows and whatnot, Sherman Oaks and those areas, you would think, but I never came across one.
Was the Nicole Brown, Ronald Goldman case with O.J. Simpson, was that around where you worked, or?
Not at that time. I had worked West Los Angeles Division, where that crime happened, but I had worked there and left. One of the main reasons was because West Los Angeles, or the Brentwood area, those areas were what we would call over the hill. It was out of the San Fernando Valley. And so the traffic, if you're familiar with the 405 freeway, I was working middays there, and it would take me about an hour and 45 minutes to get to work. Because middays, that put me on the freeway about 9 o'clock. And the 405 is just horrendous. And I lived, well, it wasn't so far. It just took me forever to get to work.
Right.
So I transferred away from there as soon as I could and get back to closer to home.
I had a question for because when I was promoting that you were going to be on the podcast, one of our listeners reached out to me and wanted me to ask this question. Was there a sentiment of the LAPD that O.J. Simpson, there was a second person with him?
Not that I know of. I don't think so. I mean, that's just
I get it.
On what I know, but yeah, I don't think so. Now, whether or not something happened to all those clothes, something happened to his clothes.
Right.
And, there was someone that supposedly took a garment bag or something of clothing. And so did other people know? Maybe. I don't know.
Fair enough. Like I said, it was a listener wanted to know. So Los Angeles has a lot of gang activity. Did you deal with a lot of gang members? We didn't have gang. We had the Latin King. Like a lot of the gangs with the NY was in corrections. We didn't really. Now it's changed, but during my time it wasn't. Was that a lot with the gangs?
No, the gangs are very prevalent in Los Angeles, and certainly in North Hollywood we had some, and even Devonshire Division, which is where I did a lot of my career. There were pockets of gangs, and when I became a senior lead officer, which is a person who is responsible for a specific part of a division, which is the area, geographical area, I had probably one of the worst gang areas there. And things by that time, that would have been about 2006, 2005, 2006. It had calmed down a bit from the early 90s and the mid 90s because the gangs were really they were really hard on each other back then, and things had calmed down. But still, I mean, the dope was still flowing, and and that always brings drive-bys and whatnot.
Did you have any dealings with anybody on death row records?
No.
They were, doing research for this, weren't they hiring? They were hiring some LA cops to do off-duty bodyguard work, which I found, I couldn't believe that.
Yeah, and the thing about that is if you're going to be working off duty, you have to have a permit from the LAPD to do that. I don't know. It's not uncommon for police officers to do, security work, but I don't know if that the fact that they were, working for people who are associated perhaps with the gang
crime.
Yeah, exactly. If they were, I'm wondering how truthful they were on their application. Maybe it was fine, but maybe it wasn't. Who knows?
Because I wondered that, because with the NYPD to work off-duty employment, it's a lot of paperwork, and it's got to go up a chain. Your commanding officer could kick it off, then it's got to go downtown, and then it's looked at, and they look into whoever you're working. I mean, they just don't approve you. It could take a couple of months to get it approved. And I remember guys complaining all the time. It's just a security company. I don't understand, and then they find out it's got ties to organized crime. But I was wondering that, how strict they were. And speaking of death row records, did you know LAPD cop David Mack?
No, I did not.
Just for the listeners out there, David Mack, this is a wild story. Here's a guy that went to the University of Oregon on a track scholarship, and he set a couple of records. He becomes a cop. Then he does a bank robbery in which he's got his girlfriend working inside the bank, and his name has been thrown around. I'm not saying he's involved, but his name has been thrown around with the Biggie Smalls murder. Mm-hmm. And just, listen, I don't mean to beat. I'm going to ask you one more question about police corruption, then I'm going to move off it, because we had Michael Dowd. So the NYPD's got some Hall of Fame bad cops, too. We were talking the other day. You knew LAPD Detective Stephanie Lazarus.
Yeah, I did. She worked. She was the night watch detective where I worked. She was high strung. I would say she was very high strung, but I don't know if she was convicted of murder. So I guess if you're worried about someone coming after you for decades, you might be high strung, She was I got to say, she was a good detective. I think she's a hard worker. And I think that there were people who were not necessarily, well, I think people were surprised, but some people think, well, she was kind of a nut job. I didn't see her that way. But by the same token, I don't know how you go from point A to point B and wind up in prison.
Yeah. Well,
I don't get it.
To tell her story, as a rookie cop, she's dating this guy on and off, and he basically, wasn't interested in her anymore, and he was either married or engaged to another woman. She goes to the girlfriend's house and gets into a fight with her and kills her. And like you said, this case went unsolved for decades, 20-something, 30-something years, and through DNA, and I think a bite mark, they were able to, I watched the documentary on it and how they got her and how they were able to bring her into a location without her gun to interview her. And the look on her face, I mean, It just, you could just see it. Everything, like you just said, for 30 years, that burden of knowing that one day someone could tap you on your shoulder and go, your life is over. Because she knew it was coming. And just the look on her face. So that's a wild story. Again, NYPD has had some bad apples. I was reading your biography, and you worked several undercover assignments. Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, we're talking prostitution type things. We also we also did a lot of bait car type things, and what my function was to be the crazy doper. And so we would have the bait car, and I would be driving that bait car, and a police unit would pull me over and would basically go berserk to draw attention to the car. And the officers would appear to be, kind of flustered, and they would take the keys, set them on the roof of the car. And because I'm like
Right.
attacking and, just being a jerk. And so then they'd put me in the back of the car and we'd drive away. And then somebody would come and steal the car and, then get them for GTA.
That's pretty cool. They would never let us get away with that. Closest I remember, we had a car from an insurance company with a punched out lock and a punched out ignition and missing airbags, and then we would set it somewhere, like by the junkyards and stuff, hoping that someone. And they were smarter than us. They never took the bait on those. You were named Officer of the Year in 1997. That must have opened up a lot of opportunities for you.
Yes and no. I mean, I got to be honest. When they when they told me that, I knew that they had quarterly. They had quarterly things, Officer of the Quarter type thing, and I didn't realize it was such a big deal. And then there was this big luncheon, and my husband and my mother went. And as far as opportunities, it's I was happy with being a patrol officer. I was happy with working the streets. So I had no grand illusions of, becoming a commander or anything like that. I just wanted to go out and catch bad guys, quite honestly. And it doesn't sound, what do I want to say, glamorous or noteworthy cases. I had no involvement in it. But I'll tell you what, if you had a burglar in your neighborhood, I was going after them. And I had a great partner, and she and we worked the graveyard shift together, and we just stumbled into stuff and made these great arrests, and it was good stuff.
And later on, you became a crime analyst in the war room. Is that CompStat?
No, it was not. What happened was one of the neighboring divisions, I'm trying to think. I guess it was their captain. He put together, I don't even remember what he called it, but he put together where some police officers, 2P3s, so they're training officers, worked together, and they would analyze the crimes from the day before. They would come in real early, and they would come in and analyze the crimes from the day before, get them mapped where they were occurring, and then they had a cadre of police officers where they would assign these officers, and it would be pretty effective in getting the criminals, coming up with them. Or it could also shift the problem. They'd see, the area's flooded over here with black and whites. So, okay, we're going to move over to this neighborhood type thing. Well, so I was selected to do that with another P3, and I loved that job. I loved that because when we started, I think we had either 18 to 25 officers that we said, look, this is where you need to go. This is where we want you for this, type of thing. And it really did. It worked. I'd have to be at work at 4:00 in the morning so that we'd have time to go through I saw you roll your eyes. Actually, well, it wasn't great because I had to get up at 2 in order to be there. But, you manage. And so you go and you'd read the crime reports, and I will never forget, we had a radio so we could hear what was going on. And I'm going through the crime reports, and we had a robbery where a white pickup truck was used, and it had some kind of lettering on the side. And so I'm listening, and all of a sudden I hear, and this is probably around, I'd just gotten to work, maybe about 4:30, quarter to 5, and the dispatcher comes on, and Foothill, the neighboring division, is in pursuit of a white pickup truck. And so they finally get those people in custody, and they were wanted for robbery. So I get on the radio and I said, hey, can you ask them, does that white pickup truck have writing on the side? And sure enough, it did. And so we were able to tie them right away into our robbery.
Well, that's cool. Did that start under Bratton?
Well, perhaps. Might have been Willie Williams. I'm not sure. This was something that was more created in one division, and it worked so well, at least in Valley Bureau, so then other divisions either adopted it, and one of our captains was right on it. And like I said, I was grateful that he asked me to do it because I really enjoyed it.
Bratton was the commissioner though for a while, right? When you were there?
He was a police chief, yes.
Oh, police. Okay, so you had police chief. What was the sentiment about him?
I think that LAPD prefers, at least the patrol officers, I think they prefer somebody who's been through our academy and come up our ranks rather than having someone come in out of the cold to be our leader. And so I can tell you that I did have an interaction, and I really don't remember, it's been a long time, but I know that we were taking him on a tour. We were in, I don't know if it was some kind of a van or something, and we're going through, different parts of our division and whatnot, and he was uninterested in what the patrol people might have to say.
He's an interesting guy. So, and the NYPD is like that too, as far as they like people that came through the police academy and knows what's going on. They just didn't get dropped off. He was a breath of fresh air for us because I got hired in '87, and we had some real winners as police commissioner. One guy was just a clown. Another guy, he was one of these guys. He would bounce from department to department. Bratton got his feet in with the NYPD. He started as our transit police guy, and he did a phenomenal job. He really did, and we liked him. For a guy that came from Boston, from out of town, the only problem I have with him is, it's not a problem. I mean, he was probably the best police commissioner when I was there, but he started CompStat, which started out okay. It really did. It did a lot of good, but it's like chemotherapy, and just to keep doing it and expecting the same numbers when crime is going down, you're creating problems. And then it became Lord of the Flies when you'd have these chiefs and inspectors going down to CompStat, and who was in the cool group and who was moving this guy out of this division because they had the power and they don't like them anymore. But overall, he did a lot of good as far as lowering crime in New York City. And what really pisses me off is he changed the uniforms. So we had the iconic powder blue top shirts and the navy pants, and probably 94, 95, we got the navy like you guys, and we're like, well, what the hell is this? We preferred the powder blue. Nobody asked us. And then the same thing with the blue and white police cars.
Right.
We went to the white police cars. I mean, come on. Who's going to take someone serious driving a white car? So we're kind of like, what the hell is this crap? You know what I mean? But overall, and I get it when someone comes from another agency. It's like he's got his way of doing things. And like you said, he was uninterested in what you guys had to say, and you work there.
Yeah. I think, too, you bring up CompStat. I don't know what it was like for you guys, but for our supervision, it was a game of gotcha.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about XYZ and something very minute? Why would they know? Why would they care? I mean, can you tell me what color? I know that supervision, there was a lot of time wasted
Yes.
preparing for it. So much time that could have been used,
Yeah.
better used.
Fighting crime.
Yeah.
As opposed to a homework assignment. For those of you who don't know, what the NYPD and then LAPD would do is they had ComStat. So, say for argument's sake, the Bronx was up 1 month. They would bring every commanding officer from the Bronx down to one police plaza, and they would have all these chiefs lined up. And then sometimes it would be like an audience. It was like the Coliseum at the Coliseum in Rome. And they would say, "All right, commanding officer of the 4-4 precinct, get up there." And they would just start firing questions at him. And what have you done to address it? But it got mean-spirited because the people that ran ComStat had a specialized unit, and they would go into these precincts a couple of weeks before ComStat and take photos of problems and conditions. And as the guy's on the podium explaining that he got rid of his homeless problem, and back of him, they're showing the homeless people. Or another time they had a chief up there, or an inspector telling a story, and they had a Pinocchio in back of him with a nose growing. So,
Oh my
like you
God.
said, it turned into a mean-spirited game of gotcha, and
Wow.
it bled down. Because at first it started with the commanding officer, and the commanding officer's like, "I'm not going down there." So what they would do is they would send their executive officer, and then they would send in lieutenants down there. My lieutenant, who was a great guy, and then it bled into organized crime, which is ridiculous because the whole reason you set up an organized crime division is we don't tell patrol what we're doing because of the corruption aspect. If there's someone in the precinct that's grown too close to a subject, you don't want them passing that information off to their friends. And I remember one time I killed more trees than Paul Bunyan because I was in my 18th, 19th year. I knew how all the computer systems worked, but I wasn't a computer guy. I used it to make arrests. My lieutenant would say, "Oh, great. I got ComStat next week. I need you to get me a list of every parolee that lives in the Bronx, and then I want you to interview them and ask them if they're stealing cars." And I'm like, "I think that's unconstitutional." I says, "And number two, these guys don't live at these addresses. They got paroled. How many?" So yeah, it just became, it was wasting time to prove something. Your husband was also an LA police officer. Where did he work?
Well, we met at North Hollywood Division, but he was a firearms instructor.
Oh, okay.
He also worked 77th. That's where he was his first couple of years, which would be down near Watts and the south end of town. And then North Hollywood, and then he went to firearms, and that's where he retired from.
What's your favorite LAPD movie?
Oh my goodness, my favorite LAPD movie. Perhaps Mulholland Falls.
Oh, all right. That was a good one.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that. That was a good one. I thought you were going to say Colors or something, but that's a good one.
No, back in the day, and things were done quite differently then.
I'm sure they were.
So, I don't know. That's what came to mind.
Listen, there's no wrong answers here. So, what got you into writing?
Well, I thought that I was going to be a romance writer, and I joined the Romance Writers of America. And my critique partner, she'd say, "Hey, this is really good." She says, "But where's the romance?" And I said, "Oh, I'll throw that in later." She says, "Well, you're killing off a lot of people. You really need, where's the romance?" "I'll throw it in later." So actually, my first book is more of a romantic suspense. But I had figured out by the time that book was published, I'd figured out, well, maybe I'd better kind of go more towards mystery, thriller, crime novels. And so that's what happened.
And tell us about your books. Like, are there a series or the themes? And
I have 3 series. I have my Deadly series, which has 6 novels and 1 novella that I have in the middle there, and that's the Deadly series. And then I have the Buckner trilogy, and those books basically follow a husband, wife, and their child, and the first book of that trilogy is loosely, I don't want to say inspired by, but loosely generated from the Christopher Dorner case. If you're familiar, he was the officer that had been fired from the LAPD, and he went on kind of a rampage where he was he killed the daughter of one of our captains, and
Oh,
the
right.
daughter's
Yeah, I remember that. Okay.
yeah, and then he killed he was went out to San Bernardino County and shot. I think he killed an officer out there too. Then he wound up in Big Bear where the cabin went on fire. Anyway, Collateral Damage was kind of the seed was planted for that book with that deal, and so then the trilogy goes on from there. And then I just released earlier this year book 1 in a more patrol-oriented series, and that's Grave Impact. And what I covered in that book, because it's what, sign of the times, it involves these organized shoplifting crews. And then I weave in how someone gets involved in all of that, and then the book goes on.
I was going to say, how can your police career not bleed into your writing?
Oh, well, it does. I mean, it does. My Deadly series is dealing mostly with the detectives. And while I was on loan to detectives for a while, I never was a detective. I kick myself now, for not doing that. But again, like I said earlier, I was kind of a street gal, street cop. And, so yeah, it bleeds in. It's very rare for me to use something just, in fact, I don't think I've ever done it, where I've used something straight off as it was in real life. I had bits of this, bits of that.
I love your book cover. Do you have one of your books around?
Moment. I just, so let's see here. So here's Collateral Damage.
Those are
That's
great
the
book
one.
covers.
And then this is the second one. This is Damaged Goods. I'm sorry, the lighting's not great.
No, it's fine. You're fine.
And then Damage Control. And then the most recent book is Grave Impact. So I don't have the Deadly books here, but they're in ebook form only right now.
And where can our listeners find your books?
They're everywhere. If you're an Amazon reader, you can get them there. You can get them on Apple Books, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Google Play. They're there.
And what's your latest book again?
Grave Impact. And if you go to my website, there's a prequel short story called Grave Ambition that you can read for free there. And interestingly enough, the short story I wrote for an anthology that I was in. And so I took a character from that short story and brought them back in Grave Impact.
Where can we find your website?
KathyBennett.com. 2 N's, 2 T's, Kathy with a K.
Kathy, thank you so much for spending this time with us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I do want to tell you, when you contacted me and I saw that your name, Vic Ferrari, I can tell you that the book I'm working on right now, which is part of my Deadly series, and this guy's appeared in several of my books, I have a gunner Ferrari. So when I saw your name, I kind of laughed. I thought, oh, I have Gunner Ferrari in my
You
books.
can call him Vic. That's just fine with me.
Well, maybe if he gets married, he'll marry Vic or have a child named Vic.
I'm all for it. Kathy, again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And as always, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, especially my listeners in Baton Rouge, Montreal, Bergenfield, New Jersey, Corpus Christi, Texas, and I love this city, Accident, Maryland. If you work in law enforcement or have an interesting criminal background, drop me a note on Twitter or Instagram at VicFerrari50. If you watch the show on YouTube, please hit and like the subscribe button. Thank you again, and I'll see you all next week.
Bye. Thank you.